Well, welcome back, everyone. Hope everyone had a great 4th of July weekend. So we are going to go ahead and dive right back in where we left off at 1 Kings chapter 13. We ended on the death of Elisha, and now we're going to move forward to the latter half of 2 Kings, where we'll have two major crises that we're going to go over. The first one is going to be the rise of a new worldwide empire called Assyria. They're going to take over pretty much the known world throughout the Middle East and destroy Samaria in the northern kingdom in exile, and replace the population with those from Mesopotamia. And then after Assyria, we'll focus on the Babylonians, who will eventually conquer and overtake Jerusalem. So those are going to be the two main focuses that we're going to conclude on. We'll also try to mention a little bit about the biblical prophets who are kind of the main protagonists during this section of the Bible. And also two great kings that we'll mention are Hezekiah and Josiah, so we'll also take some time to focus on them as well. But picking up on chapter 14, we're going to get through kind of a string of different kings. So the first one we're going to focus on is Amaziah. So after, if you remember, Joash, who repaired the temple, he gets assassinated. His son Amaziah will take over for him. He will put to death the two assassins that killed his dad. And what he is most famous for is he actually gets really arrogant. He goes on a campaign against Edom, but that will kind of give him a big head, and he will be the first king of Judah who goes to war with Israel. So he did what Rehoboam never could do, and actually goes to war with Israel and tries to reclaim the kingdom. Of course, that fails in spectacular fashion, and the Israel king Jehoash, he's going to, deflect Amaziah in a battle, and then will push forward into Jerusalem and loot the city. So that does not go well for him. So he eventually gets assassinated himself at Lachish, and now let's focus back on Israel. So Jehoash passes away, and his son Jeroboam II will succeed him, and he'll have a nice long 41-year reign. And we are also introduced to a prophet that advises him named Jonah, who we all know gets swallowed up by a whale or a fish. But that story of Jonah is not till much, much later, when towards the end of his life, assumingly, when Assyria becomes much more prominent. So Jeroboam II, he becomes a successful military leader, and Jonah will tell him how much God is going to give him into the hands of the Arams. One major factor that's at play is, if you remember, so we have Israel over here, and we have Syria being a buffer from Mesopotamia, which is over here to the Far East, and the Far East is just really hammering Syria right now. So because of that, Aram is like really getting attacked by one side from this rising empire. And so, Jeroboam II is able to come in and capitalize on the opportunity to reclaim some of the land from Aram. Going back to Judah, so Uzziah, he gets killed, and his son Uzziah becomes the new king, and he's going to rule for 52 years, even though he's going to be disabled for part of that reign. And we're about to hear about why that is. He gets an overall pleasing rating from the author of Kings. But he fails to remove some of the foreign shrines in Judah. And because of this, God will strike him with leprosy, and he is forced to be in isolation at some point of his reign. And so his son, Jotham, pretty much becomes like the de facto ruler, reigning in his place. So alongside Jonah, who is one of the earliest prophets during this time, we also have other prophets, Hosea and Amos. Those are probably the two earliest written prophets in that section. And they are writing to Israel, warning them about the upcoming judgment of Assyria. But obviously, Israel is about to be gone. So I think Hosea and Amos are pretty much the two prominent prophets from the northern kingdom. Everyone else is from Judah. So they become active down south where Uzziah is. That's where you have Isaiah and Micah, who will be prominent during those administrations. And so let's focus back on Israel. So Jeroboam II, he passes away after his reign. And if you remember, when Jehu overtook and wiped out the house of Ahab, God promised him that he would have 4 generations of descendants on the throne. So Jeroboam II was going to be the last of the 4. So we are back to having the same, Jeroboam situation where, his son gets killed, and then there's just this big string of new rulers, that kind of, just a power grab happening, and that's going to be the case all the way up until the northern kingdom falls. So the first one, Zechariah, will succeed Jeroboam II. He is going to get assassinated by a guy named Shallum. Shallum rules for like a month, and then he gets assassinated by a guy named Menahem. Menahem rules for longer. He rules for about a 10-year period. And then this is when Assyria is getting really serious, and King Pul from Assyria basically invades Israel, and Menahem is forced to surrender. So now they become kind of a vassal state of Assyria and are no longer an independent kingdom, and that's going to be the case until they rebel and get destroyed. So Menahem, his son, Pekahiah, he will become the ruler for a brief 2-year period. Then his aide, Pekah, is going to assassinate him. He's going to be the new ruler. He had some sort of revolt with some of his subjects in the Transjordan region rebelled against him, and so he is killed, and Pekah becomes a new ruler. So Pekah rules for a nice 20 years, and then a new Assyrian king will come to the scene named Tiglath-Pileser. And Tiglath will have this full-scale invasion of the whole Palestinian region, including taking down Israel. And so that's actually going to be, for the first time, a large-scale exile of Israelites are going to be taken into exile and back to Assyria with Tiglath. And during this chaotic period, Pekah is once again assassinated, and Hoshea will take his place and will be the final king of the northern kingdom before it falls. But before it falls, we're going to pan back to Judah one last time. And so Jotham, Uzziah's son, he passes away, and his son Ahaz becomes just this really bad ruler. He aligns himself with Israel and the house of Ahab and all those gods, the Phoenician gods. He sacrifices his son. So he's, bringing all this terribleness back to Judah. And during this time, he is very similar to Asa and a kind of a shrewd politician in the sense that, if you remember, usually what happens is Israel and Judah team up against Aram. That's usually what happens. But because of this growing world power called Assyria, Aram and Israel are forced to team up against Assyria. And what they want to do is to try to coerce Judah to join them. And what does Judah do? He's like, no way, I'm going to be on the winning team. I'm going to join Assyria. So Ahaz pleads to Assyria saying, Tiglath, I'm your best friend. I'll be your subject. I'll be your loyal vassal. And his advisor, Isaiah, is totally against this. He said, what are you doing? Don't be, believe in God, believe in Yahweh, and trust in Him, and your city will be saved. Of course, he does not listen, and so he goes ahead and joins forces. So Judah will join forces with Assyria, and of course, they're going to completely, Israel and Aram have no chance. And so eventually, in 733 BC, Damascus will fall, And so Assyria is kind of this slow-moving death ball, just kind of, overtaking the region slowly. So Damascus falls, King Rezin, the king of Aram, falls. And then now the next target is going to be Israel, northern Israel, the northern kingdom. So back to Hosea. So Hosea becomes ruler for 9 years. And a new king of Assyria comes to the scene to replace Tiglath, named Shalmaneser V. So Shalmaneser will approach Samaria, and obviously Hosea does not want to be steamrolled, so he's like, okay, I'll wave the white flag. He surrenders and pays tribute initially to Assyria, but eventually will stop and will go behind Shalmaneser's back and try to find like an ally in Egypt, the other world power that can compete with Assyria. And so he kind of goes behind their back and tries to form an alliance with the king of Egypt, the pharaoh there. And so Shalmaneser hears about this betrayal, and now it's all over. Like, it's completely, he's not going to make the mistake of making them a rebellious state. So he is just going to completely decimate Samaria, the capital of Israel. So there is this big 3-year siege, and after the siege, in 722 BC, the walls crumble, and Samaria will fall into the hands of Assyria, and all the worthwhile inhabitants will be taken there as captives. And in chapter 17, there's just this big, long theological explanation of why Israel got destroyed. And then the other half of chapter 17 focuses on the origins of the Samaritans. So the Samaritans, also called the people of the land, these are going to be a known quantity throughout the rest of what's like in Ezra and Nehemiah. You'll hear about them, and you'll also hear about them in the New Testament. So what these people are is Shalmaneser will take the people of Israel, take the inhabitants, and what he does in turn is take the other Mesopotamian people he's conquering and those in Syria, and he's going to take those people and put them into where Israel once was. And so you have this completely, all these people being in places they're not familiar with. There's going to be introduction to Israel to all these foreign gods from, the Tigris and the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia are going to have their religion. They're going to have their gods worship in Israel, and it's just going to be a hot mess. There's going to be people who are going to still worship Yahweh, but at the same time, they're going to also worship their local gods that they grew up with. So it's just a really hot mess, and the author of Kings makes it clear to the audience that this is still the case. This is still the case, that these are a hopeless intermix of people compromising the worship of Yahweh, and that's what the Samaritans will be. And when we get to Ezra and Nehemiah, these people are going to be termed in a derogatory way called the people of the land. That's just a derogatory term for them. So we'll get more on that when we get to them. So anyways, so it's game over for Israel. Everything's, they're wiped out. They've been completely replaced by a new population. And now Assyria is heading down south. And what is their next destination? It's Jerusalem, right? So they have their eyes set on Judah. So Ahaz, if you remember, is allied with Assyria, but his son, named Hezekiah, is going to turn everything around. So Hezekiah is going to be, the greatest king since Solomon and David. He is just has all kinds of reforms. He gets rid of all the foreign worship that Ahaz introduced, taking out the idols and the pillars out of the temple. And he also turns against Assyria, and he wants to, fight for the independence of Israel. And Isaiah is, rooting for him. He knows that, God is going to be with them. The promises of David is going to be with them, and all he needs is God. So once again, a new king arises to replace Shalmaneser, named Sennacherib. And so 5 years after Samaria falls, Sennacherib has his sights set on Judah, and so he starts an invasion in there, and he will go to a village outside of Jerusalem called Lachech, And if you know your history, there's a famous wall where you can see, I don't know what museum it's in, but it has pictures depicting this famous siege of Lachish that Sennacherib kind of celebrates himself with. So interesting fact there. So he's conquering all these unwalled cities and towns around Jerusalem, and once he approaches the walled capital, he basically sends this high official called the Rabshakeh. So the Rabshakeh isn't a name of anybody, it's just a title, it's a Babylonian official name, this top diplomat that goes, and he goes to the walls and makes all these threats, saying of how much they're going to be, why resist? Assyria has, destroyed Aram, they destroyed Samaria, and if you remember, Samaria is actually bigger than Jerusalem during this time, so Samaria didn't stand a chance. What hope does Jerusalem have? So Hezekiah is lying to you, he's going to be the reason why you all are killed, and so he makes all these threats, curses the God Yahweh, and says, if you guys don't surrender, you're gonna get it. But Hezekiah is firm, he's really relying on God, he's not giving in, but he hears this message reported back to him, and he's just, really in tears. He sees the reality around him, and he's tearing his clothes, going to the temple, and getting Isaiah to find support. And so Isaiah will come with him, and he says, hey, be really confident. And he gives him a very specific oracle where Sennacherib is going to come, he's going to hear a false rumor, he's going to go away back to his homeland and get assassinated, and that's exactly what happens. But Isaiah is giving him confidence that Jerusalem's going to be saved. Just be faithful and keep believing. And so Sennacherib, it continues his campaign around Judah. He takes out another town called Libnah, and so if you remember, he's overtaking Egypt. So at this point, Assyria has beaten Egypt. He's overtaken it, and south of Egypt is Ethiopia. And so the Ethiopian king is giving him a hard time, and so his attention really needs to go to Africa and not in Palestine. So Sennacherib gets really impatient. He's like, okay, I can't be bogged down in Palestine. I really need to get this, get Hezekiah to surrender the city so I can just move on. And so he sends these threatening letters to Hezekiah, and Hezekiah again tears his robes, goes to the temple, takes the letters and spreads it around, and makes this famous final prayer of desperation to be saved from Sennacherib, and tells how Assyria is these false gods, or you don't have any real power, but Yahweh, he's a true God, he has a true power, and let the nations know that. So God answers Hezekiah's prayer through Isaiah. Isaiah will say that the Lord has said thus, that he is going to pronounce judgment on Assyria, and because of their blasphemy and their arrogance, and he will force them to return and not set a foot in Jerusalem. So in 1701 BC, the Assyrian king arrives outside of Jerusalem and prepares for a big siege, but overnight an angel will come and strike down 185,000 soldiers with a plague, and by the morning they all die. Afterwards, Sennacherib will retreat back to Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, and just like Isaiah said, during his worship of his temple god, his two sons will sneak and assassinate him, and after that they'll flee, and then another one of his sons named Esarhaddon will be the next Assyrian ruler. So whoopee, Jerusalem is saved, yay, for now, for the moment. And then next we're going to focus on Babylon. So chapter 20 is basically wraps up Hezekiah's story. There's an episode that likely took place, before, a little bit before 701 BC, where Hezekiah falls deathly ill, and Isaiah tells the king, get your house in order because Assyria is going to fall, or you're going to die. So Hezekiah is going to die any day now. And Hezekiah's like, oh no, I don't want to die, please, Lord, save me. So the Lord hears his pleas, and he's like, okay, you know what, you're going to live, and I'm going to give you 15 more years to live. And so he gives him some figs, gives him some healing routine, and he lives for another 15 years. And just like the Lord said, he's going to be promised to be saved from Assyria. During this time where he's sick, he gets these foreign guests who are also anti-Assyrian, from a faraway ally, King Merodach from a little-known town called Babylon, who I'm sure is going to be relevant in the very near future. But for right now, they're kind of friends with each other. He goes and, he appreciates, he gets all these gifts and well wishes from the king of Babylon. And in response, Hezekiah gave this, majestic tour, show off to these exotic people, all the greatness of the treasuries of Jerusalem, all, where all the locations are, the temple, everything, the vassals. So after all this, Isaiah hears about this and he's like, what are you doing? Like, why would you do that? And, show off to these people. And he gives them an oracle saying that, God is going to, everything you showed these guys are going to be taken by Babylon one day. And even your sons will be forced to go and be eunuchs in the court of the Babylonian king, which is not good news for Hezekiah. But the good thing for him is that he's not going to live long enough for this all to happen. So it's not really until about 70 years later, in 629 BC, where Babylon becomes a much more powerful force. They team up with the Medes and other Mesopotamian tribes, and then they'll kind of do like a big, force against Nineveh. And in 612, they succeed in toppling the great city of Nineveh. And the biblical prophet Nahum, if you're familiar with that book of the Bible, that is a poem celebrating the fall of Nineveh, judgment, casting judgment upon these wicked Assyrians, only to be replaced by another wicked ruler, the Babylonians. So another thing before we close out with Hezekiah is that he is credited with building what's called the Siloam Tunnel. So this famous aqueduct that transports fresh water into the city of Jerusalem, where even in a siege they'll have fresh water. And I believe if you go to Israel to this day, you can still see the Siloam Tunnel that built, all the way back in Hezekiah's time, which is a pretty cool thing to see. So now we're going to focus back on Babylon. Babylon is on the rise when we get to chapter 21, and Hezekiah is going to die, and he's going to be replaced by a wicked king, probably one of the most wicked king, even worse than Ahaz, is Manasseh. So Manasseh, has this 55-year rule, and he is just like, Ahab on steroids. He is going back, rebuilding what all the reforms that Hezekiah did. He's bringing them back. He's bringing the Phoenician gods back. He's sacrificing his sons to the god, and bringing, divination, bringing magicians. And it says he put many innocent people to death. So that could be a reference to what Jezebel did when she basically committed a genocide against all the Yahewists. All the people wanting to only worship Yahweh, they were eliminated. So there would be no dissent. So Manasseh seems to have a similar regime going on, and because of that, God is like, okay, I've had enough. No longer will Jerusalem be saved. Like, there is going to be judgment, and things are going to be bad. So Manasseh dies after a long rule. Then Amnon his son will rule for a very brief amount of time. After 2 years, he gets assassinated, and the people will put his 8-year-old son named Josiah to the throne. And of course, yes, this is the Josiah we've been waiting for. So probably on the top list of kings after Solomon is going to be Josiah. Followed by Hezekiah, and then everyone else is kind of gets they're in a bottom tier below everyone. But Hezekiah and then Josiah are going to be really righteous kings to make all this reform. And what makes Josiah so special is that he famously discovers a scroll in the temple. So right now it's 622 BC. About 90 years ago, Joash repaired the temple and renovated it, but it's been about 100 years. It's due for another overhaul. So he goes and gets his high priest Hilkiah to go and get out, do the special deposit box like Joash did, and get all the repairs done for the carpenters and the specialized workers. But during this process, the high priest will come upon this scroll, this mysterious scroll hidden in the back somewhere. And more than likely what it is some form of the book of Deuteronomy that we have today. And a scribe will take it and interpret it and tell it to Josiah. And Josiah will be, tearing his clothes. He's like, oh my goodness, how has, my fathers have never seen this before. How has, we've been so neglectful from worshiping Yahweh the way we've been supposed to. So he says, go and seek out a prophet and get this, what fate do we have for not listening to this special scroll? So the officials go out and they find a prophetess in Jerusalem named Huldah. Huldah will tell King Josiah that, yes, indeed, wrath has been building up against Jerusalem because of this disobedience. But because of Josiah has humbled himself, this great wrath isn't going to be during his lifetime. So it'll be later on. So after hearing Huldah's words, Josiah will have this big public assembly at the temple and getting all the people to gather and hear and have this public reading of the scroll, the book of Deuteronomy, read out loud. And so who knows when the last time this was really heard from. But basically, after it's been read out loud, they have kind of a covenant together where Josiah will dedicate himself to the covenant. The people will, formally be recognizing the covenant. You think of it as like a contract where the people sign up for what the words of the scroll are saying. And so from this point on, the following reforms are going to be enacted. The first one is that all the idols are going to be brought out and burned outside of Jerusalem. The non-Levite priesthood are going to be delegitimized. They're going to be dissolved. All the high places on the shrines, not just in Judah, not just in Jerusalem, but all the high places anywhere are going to be destroyed. And if you remember, when Jeroboam came to power, he made a rival temple site that rivaled Jerusalem, Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. And so that shrine in Bethel, and if you remember, if you can think way back in 1 Kings, he's dedicating himself to this temple, and he's interrupted by this heckler. And the heckler is a prophet that warned him, saying, a son of David one day, he is going to destroy this place. And lo and behold, the day has come. So Josiah goes into Israelite territory, destroys that site in Bethel, and he banishes, and he also permanently defiles it. So if you burn human bone on any worship site, this was a universal rule in the ancient world, that it would permanently defile that site. So it's almost like putting salt on anything green. It's going to be permanently defiled. And the same happens when you we do the same thing to any shrine or altar. So now that shrine in Bethel that Jeroboam set up is completely dysfunctional. So he does this. He banishes all the necromancers, the male prostitutes, the magicians, all that stuff. And for the first time since Joshua, if you remember all the way after Joshua conquered Israel, is that he hosts the Passover sacrifice in accordance to Deuteronomy 16, verse 5. So not long after this, Josiah has an untimely death. So right after the Passover feast, in a famous event in 609 BC. So if you remember in 612, 3 years earlier, that's when Nineveh falls. So Nineveh falls by this alliance of Babylonians, and so, it's kind of worldwide news that these Babylonians are going to be troubled. So Pharaoh, who is the other world power at this time, is really worried. He wants to get a buffer away to slow down these Babylonians before they get to him in Africa. So he tries to build a bulwark, and he goes towards Syria, near the part of Aram, around where Damascus is, in order to set up an outpost and kind of cut off the Babylonians before they reach Egypt. And so on his way, he's interrupted by Josiah. So Josiah comes out of nowhere for reasons not made clear at all in the Bible and attacks the Pharaoh of Necho. And you get more details in 2 Chronicles version of this event. And there's kind of dialogue in 2 Chronicles chapter 35. Josiah and Pharaoh have this dialogue. And basically, Pharaoh says, I have no beef with you, I have no reason to attack you, just get out of my way. And Josiah is like very belligerent. He's like, no, and he attacks him. One theory why this might be is because, he might not know how big of a deal Babylon is. He's still, Assyria just fell. Necho is reinforcing the Assyrians that are left over, that are surviving, that are resisting Babylon, and maybe he just really hates Assyria, and so he really doesn't want Pharaoh to make them any stronger. So he goes to try to fight them, and of course, just like Ahab, he gets shot by an arrow. He retreats back to Jerusalem, and on the way back, he bleeds out and dies. And everything, everybody's super sad. If you hear, if you read in the book of Jeremiah, this was just a huge turning point, really sad. This great king, this king that has been so supportive of Yahweh, is dead. And now, after he dies, you're going to, we've really reached downhill for Jerusalem. So after Josiah dies, you have some prominent second generation written prophets in the Bible. So if you know the book of Habakkuk, Zephaniah, most prominently Jeremiah, these are accounts and oracle prophets warning about Babylon and the coming judgment after Josiah, because things get real bad after Josiah. So Josiah dies, his son Jehoaz will go, and he's only king for 3 months. So if you remember, Pharaoh is on his way to Syria. He's stationed there, and not long afterwards, 3 months later, Josiah's son, Jehoaz, will go up and basically surrender to Pharaoh and say, hey, my dad, I don't know what he was thinking, but, we're going to surrender, and we're going to be loyal to Pharaoh and hopefully not worry about Babylon. And Pharaoh Necho is, he takes this opportunity just to hold him hostage. So instead of accepting his terms, he captures him, he kidnaps him, and holds him as leverage against the city of Jerusalem, and sends him back to Egypt and installs a loyal, almost like a puppet ruler to take his place. So he takes another one of Josiah's sons named Eliakim. He renames him Jehoiakim, and Jehoiakim will be just this, loyal foot soldier of Pharaoh collecting taxes for him. So, so just like what happened with King Pul in Assyria and Samaria, from this point on, Jerusalem will no longer be an independent state. They are now at the mercy of Egypt. So now Egypt is taking over their territory, and they have this puppet ruler loyal to Pharaoh. So as you can imagine, things go downhill from here. Later on, Babylon will eventually defeat Egypt. So Egypt and Babylon, just as predicted, are going to go out. They'll be in a war. Egypt will lose this war, and this king, this great army commander and ruthless king named Nebuchadnezzar comes to power, and he will rule the whole Judea, and he will rule like everything from Africa to the Middle East to Mesopotamia, just everywhere. He'll rule it all. And so Nebuchadnezzar will take over, Pharaoh, Necho and Pharaoh. So now Jehoiakim will be loyal to, So Jehoiachin, his son, Jehoiakim has passed away. Jehoiachin, his son, is going to be loyal only to Babylon. And of course, he doesn't really like Babylon, so he rebels against them in 597 BC. Nebuchadnezzar will react. He'll go to Jerusalem, siege it, and Jehoiachin is forced to surrender. So he doesn't want a bloody siege. So he, unlike Hezekiah, who resisted Assyria, he's going to give in to them and allow Nebuchadnezzar to loot the city. But not only does he loot the city, what else does he loot? He loots the people. So he gets a lot of the royal officials, including Jehoiachin. He captures him. He captures many of the famous prophets you might know of. If you've heard of Daniel and Ezekiel, they are captured and taken to exile. If you read Daniel chapter 1 through 6, you'll hear about the accounts of Daniel in Nebuchadnezzar's court, while Ezekiel will be just with the common everyday people prophesying in the land of Babylon. So he's being taken, and he goes ahead and installs a new king, yet another son of Josiah named Mattaniah, and he is renamed Zedekiah. So Zedekiah will be the new puppet ruler and will be the last ruler of Jerusalem before it falls. So chapter 25, we're getting to the final episode of Jerusalem, and I really encourage everyone here to read Jeremiah's account. I'm going to spare you a lot of the details. I'm going to go mainly in King's account, but if you really want the full story, read Jeremiah. So Kings only does one chapter on this, while the book of Jeremiah has about 7 or 8 chapters, Jeremiah 37 through 44, detailing, Jeremiah being an eyewitness, so he was, privy, of these events. Like, he was right there in the middle of everything. So I really encourage you to see that as like the superior account of what we're about to go over. So, just like Jehoiachin, Zedekiah will again rebel and tries to make an alliance with the Phoenicians, with the Ammonites, like whoever he can, and revolt against Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar's like, okay, no more of this. We are going to completely decimate Jerusalem once and for all. So about 11 years after the first exile, now is going to be, the main siege. So he is going to put on a horrific siege of Jerusalem. It's very famous. I hope, you guys really study it and appreciate it, because this is a big, major event, especially if you're Jewish. It's a major event. Remembering the Ninth of Av and the terror that happened in Jerusalem. If you want to read more details about the travesty, read the book of Lamentations, read Jeremiah. Just the horrors of what happened there are foretold in that. And even in some of the Psalms, we'll talk about this tragic day. But just like what we've talked about in ancient warfare, you don't just go there with guns blazing. You starve out the walled nation, you weaken them, and once the wall is breached and they're weakened, you go and basically just wreak havoc. There's not going to be resistance. You're going to have a starving population of helpless people you can easily slaughter. So that's what happens exactly to Jerusalem. So eventually, the walls of Jerusalem crack, and the Babylonians will flood in to kill the helpless Israelites, or not Israelites, but Judaites, and from there, Zedekiah, with his royal entourage, will retreat through a secret passage through the royal house, and will leave, going towards the Jordan River to retreat, and they get to as far as Jericho, which, if you remember from Joshua, is like right on the precipice of the Jordan River. He goes there, but he's quickly arrested and is taken up to Riblah. If you remember, that's where Pharaoh Necho was stationed at. This is where Nebuchadnezzar is also stationed at. So he goes up to Riblah for kind of a show trial. It's not a real fair trial. It's basically, you're gonna, you committed high treason, and you're gonna get a punishment worse than death. And the punishment worse for death for Zedekiah is he's sentenced to watching all of his sons get killed right in front of him, and it's the last thing he ever sees in a very literal fashion. So he sees his sons killed, and then his eyes are going to be gorged out, just like Samson. So he's blinded, and he's taken back in chains to Babylon, where he'll, die in disgrace. So that is the end of Zedekiah. That is kind of the end of Jerusalem as we know it. And Nebuchadnezzar is going to send another high official, Nebuzaradan. So Nebuzaradan is going to be the cleanup crew. So he is going, the city is fallen, and he's just going to turn everything to rubble. He's going to go and pillage. He's going to destroy the temple. He's going to destroy the homes. He's going to take out the walls. So the significance of taking out the rest of the walls is that now Jerusalem is like completely helpless. Like, it is just, going to be barren. And if it was ever to be rebuilt, it's going to be nearly impossible, because you need walls to defend any sort of rebuilding of it. So he completely destroys the walls, completely destroys the buildings. The palace, the whole royal district is just completely destroyed and burned down. And he sends all the royal officials. He sends the high priest Sariah and to also go to Riblah to go on another show trial where they're all executed. And then the rest of anyone who's useful will go to will go with him to back to Babylon, and he's only going to leave behind just the poorest and the least useful people, and those people are going to be left over to be field hands. So he loots the temple, takes all the pans, anything, the pots, the bronze altar, all of that is going to be disassembled and brought back to the treasury of Babylon, just like Isaiah foretold. And so, with all that complete, Nebuchadnezzar will send, he's this ruthless emperor, he's heartless, but yet he nevertheless sends a new administration down to Palestine called, the guy's name is Gedaliah. So Gedaliah, even though he's this ruthless, heartless king, he's still going to have kind of this humanitarian guy to clean up the mess. So Gedaliah will station this humanitarian site in Mizpah, which is north of Jerusalem. And so it's kind of a food and shelter for all the refugees, not only in Jerusalem, but remember, there's just destruction everywhere. All of these, villages and other people who have survived just flock to this humanitarian site, and including Jeremiah. So the rest of what happens is not in Kings, so we're going to have to look at Jeremiah starting in chapter 41 to see what happens in the rest of the story. So it picks up in Jeremiah 41. So Jeremiah 41, we have this figure called Ishmael. So we always call it as a prince of Jerusalem. So maybe he's another descendant of Josiah. We don't know. But he makes a pact with the king of Ammon, which is, if you remember, it's south of Syria, across the Jordan. And this king called Baalis is going to make some sort of agreement where he wants to kill basically the Babylonians there in the land and kind of overtake, have this kind of guerrilla rule over this, desolate land. It's kind of this, you can imagine this kind of this apocalyptic scene of, this leftover tribe from Ammon want to rule over whatever is left over here. So Ishmael goes there, and he completely decimates him and 10 soldiers, just kill everybody. He kills Gedaliah in Mizpah, kills the Babylonian soldiers that are stationed there, and also kills the refugees. And Jeremiah tells of another tale where 80 more refugees is going to come to Mizpah who have no idea, what Ishmael has done, and think that they're going to go to a humanitarian site, and are sad because even though they're Samaritans, they still miss the Temple of Solomon and weep, mourn for it. So Ishmael kind of tricks them and mourns with them, but once the walls close in and they're in Mizpah, he of course goes and slaughters them all and buries the bodies in a well. So not a very nice guy. So he then goes and takes all the survivors, including Jeremiah, and takes them as captives back to Ammon, to the king. And during this, word gets to a Jewish general who survived that's remaining around Judah, named Johanan. And so Johanan will hear about Ishmael's war crimes and goes and confronts him at the pool of Gibeon. Ishmael doesn't really fight back. He kind of flees, and his captives are kind of rescued, and so they don't have to go to Ammon, but Ishmael just runs, gets the heck out of there, and goes back to the king of Ammon and lives. And so now you have this party, including Jeremiah, of refugees that have no food, they have no shelter, and they have a bad situation on their hands because Gedaliah, Nebuchadnezzar's official, is killed, his soldiers are killed, and when word gets back to Nebuchadnezzar, they're not going to think, they're not going to hear the story of Ishmael killing everybody. They're going to, blame Johanan and the survivors, right? So Nebuchadnezzar is probably going to kill all of them if he gets word of this. So they're like, all right, let's go the opposite direction. Let's go to Egypt and get refuge there. And Jeremiah, being famously very pro-Babylonian, throughout his book, and in this moment he's like, no guys, like let's go back to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar's going to be super reasonable, he's going to be really understanding, and he's going to be merciful, and if you go back to Egypt, you're going to start worshiping these Egyptian gods. And Johanan is like, are you out of your mind? This is crazy. What in the world are you thinking? Like, Nebuchadnezzar's not going to have any mercy on us. And, you're getting all these crazy ideas from Baruch, your stupid sidekick and scribe. Don't listen to that guy. So he goes on to, after this argument, at the end of the day, after a long conversation, they end up agreeing with Johanan. So Johanan and this party, including Baruch and Jeremiah, will go down to Egypt. And that's where Jeremiah will die, and he dies as he lives, really condemning the Israelites for doing this and for worshiping the gods in Memphis and Ramesses and all these different towns that they are in Egypt. And yeah, he's just he died as he lived, very unpopular. Nobody liked him hearing his rants, and so that's how the book of Jeremiah ends. But if we go back to the very end of 2 Kings, we get kind of a glimmer of hope. So at the very end, the last 3 verses of chapter 25, the last chapter of 2 Kings, it closes with this little story where, okay, we think that there's no hope, right? Zedekiah is dead, his sons are dead, the lineage of David is completely killed off. But wait, remember that first exile 11 years earlier, what happened? Jehoiakim still survived. He's still in exile in Babylon. And so Nebuchadnezzar eventually dies, and his Marduk, his son, will rise up, and he becomes, God gives him a very sympathetic heart to Jehoiakim. So he elevates him, he gives him rations, and we can only assume from this chapter that, he's going to survive, he's going to be okay and have kids. And when we talk, when we get to the book of Ezra and the story of Zerubbabel, we'll pick up, what's to happen about 70 years later in Babylon, and see the story of how, this people who are completely decimated, nevertheless, thrive in Babylon and will eventually come back about 70 years, a lifetime later, to slowly return and rebuild this lost city that God had promised them so long ago. So with that, we'll end, and hopefully next week we'll come back into the book of Ezra.